Reading the mission gets tough on yours, Sam, so bear with me.
All right.
The mission, the need to become part of the global economy rather than just the U.S. market has never been stressed as much as it is today. Some of the SAIA members are actively involved in international trade, both exporting and importing. Many more would like to be, if only they knew how to do it and even where to start. The International Council of the SAIA has established the goal of being the forum for the education process and a resource for the information that is available. The International Council is chaired by Mr. Sam Reese of Step Up Scaffold, and the co-chair is Andrew Smith of Avanis Software Corporation. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Sam Reese.
All right, thank you very much, James. I guess I'll go ahead and share the screen for our presentation. All right, can everybody see that? Jackie, is that on?
Yes. I can see that, Sam.
All right, so well, good to see everybody, and thank you for joining the International Council's presentation on the fatality ratings, comparisons. So the presentation we're going to be having today is, first of all, we'll be talking about the general market conditions, including obviously the coronavirus's impact on the global economy. Andrew's going to be giving an update on Brexit. Second thing is we'll be looking at comparing how the construction fatality rates in the U.S. compare internationally. Third, we'll be looking at a couple of construction associations outside of the U.S. and how they go about collecting information on their incident and fatality methods. And we'll be ending the presentation with some conference presentation ideas. So, well, the international market condition, obviously, well, obviously, there's not much good news out there regarding the economy in the U.S. or the world. It reminds me of a joke. This boy comes to his father and says, I have good news and I have bad news. And the father says, look, I've heard too much bad news already. Just tell me the good news. So the son says, well, the airbags on your new car work very well. So, you know, our situation right now, there's not much positive to report. You know, the International Monetary Fund had said that last quarter they projected that 160 of their 170 countries were projected to show a growth in their GDP. As of now, this first quarter, they're expecting that all 170 countries to show a negative growth. If y'all looked at the headlines today, the US first quarter report just came out. We've contracted 4.5%. And that is only including a full month of March that is impacted by the coronavirus. So they're expecting, obviously, the second quarter to be an even larger contraction. You know, there's been not only in the US, we've heard a lot about the stimulus, the 2.5 million stimulus and some additional stimulus packages out there that they're considering. Overall, the world has combined, has put $8 trillion into the world economy, which equals out about 10% of the $80 trillion world GDP. You know, this is leading to a continued trend in our GDP to debt ratio. I mentioned in the last committee in Portland that, you know, at that time, our economy looked good. Unemployment was low, stock market was high, but this GDP to debt ratio, which started not only in our country, but is an issue in many other countries. It started as a result of the recession, has continued to get worse, and as a result of the stimulus, it's going to get even a larger percentage of every country's GDP. With that, Andrew, if you could give an update on the Brexit status.
Absolutely, Sam. Well, the one thing that the virus brought to the UK was a distinct change in the news cycle. So we only hear about Brexit about 500 times a day instead of the usual 1,000. The short story is Brexit's still going on. We're still unsure as to what our position will be come the end of this year, but the negotiations are still happening. It's still moving forward, and we certainly anticipate that by the end of this year, based upon what we're hearing today, that we're going to be out of the EU for UK will be out of the EU. So that's really the news there. As far as the impacts go, the equipment supply from Europe into the mainland UK hasn't slowed down in any way from a scaffolding standpoint, and we're in close touch with the manufacturers to understand what impact could potentially happen beyond that, and whether or not there'd be outlying effects to the US as time goes on. So it's really just a sort of sit and wait and see what's happening just now from that perspective. Thanks, Sam.
Okay, so that summarizes our international market update. On to the presentation. You know, I came into this research, we both came into this research. I didn't have an idea of where the US, as far as a construction safety, how do we compare to other countries? Didn't have any idea about it, but as I've, you know, so the question we came into our research was, you know, how does the US construction industry safety rating, how does it compare to other countries around the world? What can we learn from other countries in regards to their safety, you know, regarding anything regarding the improvement of the safety procedures? And what are other scaffold associations outside of the US doing to collect information about incidents and fatalities specific to their industries? So first, the US numbers. This chart right here shows US fatalities, total fatalities since 2003 to 2018 as a proportion of the total fatalities in the US. So on average, in the US, there are about 5,000 occupational related fatalities. And generally, construction makes up about 20% of it, around 1,000. And as you can see from this chart, you see this dip happening around 2008, which indicates, you know, as construction slows and as unemployment rises, so do fatalities. So this is where the US stands as far as the construction industry. If you look at fatalities compared to the construction industries, compared to other fatalities, the fatalities of other industries in the US, you can see that the construction industry leads as far as the number of fatalities, followed by transportation, storage, agricultural, forestry, and fishing, hotel, retail trade, and then the others as well. Well, in order to compare data between countries, it's important to look at a ratio, and the more common ratio is deaths per 100,000 employees in an industry. And as you can see, the US in 2008 had around 16 fatalities per 100,000 employees. Now, the construction industry in the US is estimated to have 7 million employees. So 7 million employees at 70 100,000 plus our rating at 16 adds up to around 1,000, which correlates to the number we saw before. How does that ratio for the construction industry compare with the other industries? So we saw that the number of deaths in the construction industry were higher than other industries, but when you look at the ratio, we're about 5th most deadly industry, you know, number 1 being agricultural, forestry, and fishing. I actually worked in Alaska back in 2005 where forestry, if you actually take out forestry by itself, I remember the number there being around 100 per 100,000. So that number is a little bit, you know, smaller if you more you know, you have if you just categorize forestry or fishing. But as you can see, construction is 5th most dangerous as a ratio of the number of workers to the fatalities. So, you know, the question was, now that we know what the US's fatality rating and how we're doing on a yearly basis, which the data shows has been fairly consistent with the exception of a, you know, a dip after the economic crisis. We look to the International Labor Organization. It's an organization that was established 100 years ago. It became part of became a UN agency in 1946. Their stated goal is that they bring together governments, employers, and workers of the 187 member states to set labor standards, develop policies, devise programs promoting decent work for all women and men. The information that we got was from the ILO Stat website, which includes information on a number of statistics that they provide, and that's where we got the fatality ratings by country. Before we show some of the comparisons, it's important to tell you about some of the challenges of comparing data in general, or specifically the fatality ratings. One is there's variable degrees of underreporting, you know, and that has a lot to do with whether or not a society has informal versus formal economies. I've seen an article written by Randstad where it showed, for example, Brazil underreports their incidents by 7 to 8 times. And regarding the fatalities, it's a little bit less clear. Also, the number of immigrants in a construction, you know, in the construction industry is a big determinant of underreporting. As an example, I've heard that Denmark, you know, 95% of the Danish construction workers are Danish. A lot of that is because of unions keeping people out, but are making the laborers, you know, the criteria for laborers outside of Denmark very high, but compared to the US, I'm not exactly certain what the ratio is, but I've seen an article out there recently that said that it's estimated that about 50% of the construction workers, let's just say in the state of Texas, are actually, they consider illegal immigrants. I haven't verified that, but just as a contrast, we know that there's a lot of immigrant workforce in the US compared to other countries. Secondly, you know, another challenge is that different countries have different criteria. They're slightly different. For example, some countries in their fatality ratings or reporting will include commuting deaths. So if you're driving to a job site, or if you're leaving a job site to go to lunch and you have a fatal accident, they will include that in the statistics. While in the US and many other countries, they don't include that. They include that as a separate auto accident, rather than putting it into the construction or that industry's fatality ratings. Another thing is the time period. There are variations. For example, in the US, I believe that OSHA says that if there's a fatality within 1 year of the accident, it would be attributed to that accident. So other countries have different varying periods. So you could be in an accident on a construction site, the fatality occurs, let's just say 8 months later as a result, and they might not include it where the US would. So these are some different criteria that different countries have. Third is there is generally there's variability in the reporting sources that ILO grabs from. So for the US, we have OSHA as a national agency. UK has the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive. And those are national agencies with a big budget that can use, you know, collect data. Other countries that the ILO included, it pulls their stuff, pulls their data from insurance records, for example. And so those are the two kind of varying reporting sources that you see. And the last challenge for comparing the fatality ratings, the fourth one, is international classifications and their revisions. A little bit more about these classifications. The international standards for industrial classifications were established back in 1948, but pretty much they were established to be able to get a common category between countries in order to be able to compare different data between countries. So there are currently, we're at our 4th revision, which occurred about 10 years ago. And, you know, there's a couple reasons for these revisions. One is every decade or periodically new industries form, so new categorizations are needed. And secondly, as every revision occurs, they start refining the definition more. So for example, if you look at these two, this information, you see the ISIC revision 3 for construction as a category and ISIC revision 4 for construction. So if I just take one of those examples and you look at revision 3, they put down building installation. Well, that was the old categorization. Revision 4 includes electrical, plumbing, and other construction installation activities. It's the 3rd one from the bottom on revision 4. So what you can see from that is that, you know, revision 3 showed construction as a much broader category, and revision 4 became a much more narrow, a little bit more specific. So how does this affect some of the data? Right here is an example. UK, they've been reporting their construction fatalities, and you can see from 2000 to 2006, they used revision 3 of the ISIC. From 2009 to 2015, they used revision 4. And what you can clearly see is that there's a trend that revision 3 being a much more broad category, the fatality ratings were higher, and there's a trend downward as the revisions became more specific in the 4th edition. Another example I found that had a lot of data between both these revisions to compare is Sweden. You know, there are examples, for example, in Sweden's 2004, where it looks like it was a low fatality rating, but in general, you can see the trend continues to show a smaller rating between the two revisions, and you know, and it's attributed to the category, not necessarily an improvement in the conditions. A third example I have of the differences, which is problematic, is the Russian Federation. As you can see, between 2007 and 2016, their fatality ratings were up as high as 34, and at best at 18 fatalities per 100,000. And all of a sudden, when they change using the new revisions, it becomes 0.18 and 0.17, which is hard to believe. More likely, the data is they're having an issue with how in the changes of the categorization. So what we did was we you know, the ILO has data on 170 countries. So just to be able to narrow the focus down, we looked at the top 20 countries ranking by total GDP, and we broke it down between the two revisions. So it's, as you can see, it's hard to compare, you know, revisions if you put them together. So we separated them. This right here is a chart showing the revisions for 3, the older revision. Actually, this is revision 4. So as you can see, the US at 14, and this is an average of all the years, at a 14 fatality rates per 100,000 is better than some of the developing countries like Turkey, Mexico, and Brazil, but they're significantly higher. We're significantly higher than a lot of the European countries: France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, the UK, as well as Japan. And I kept the Russian Federation in there, but obviously it's got some problematic. But as you can see, the US is lagging behind a lot of the European countries and other developing countries. This right here is a chart showing countries that use the 3rd revision. The US is not in there because they've been using the 4th revision, but as you can see, again, a lot of the European countries have better ratings. You see Australia in there with the best rating under revision 3, and then you can see Brazil, Russia, Korea with a worse rating. Oh, so I mean that, you know, that kind of clearly puts us, I think although there are problems with the comparison and the data in general, though, I think it lends a pretty good assessment that the US has room and to learn from some of the other countries that have a much better fatality rating. And I'll let Andrew talk about some of the construction associations that we've researched.
So thanks, Sam. What we did was we took the numbers that we'd found from the data sets we were looking at and looked to find a place that we could try and anchor some data. We found there's two associations in the UK that do look. One of these, NASC, does publish data to give us some idea from an internal reporting perspective where they stand, and the Scaffolding Association as a whole, but we try to extrapolate our findings from these two organizations and try and bring those to the forefront to see how the scaffolding industry as a whole is generating that reporting. And if we move on from here, just to give some background about the two organizations, starting, if we can, Sam, with NASC, we'll see that the NASC, Sam, could you pop slide? NASC was founded in 1945 and is actually the oldest scaffolding trade association in the UK. The interesting thing about the NASC is they are a peer audited organization, and the membership has to meet and maintain some specific standards in order to become a member and actually maintain an ongoing membership in the organization. Now, for several years, they've collected and reported data. The data is collected internally by the Confederation, prepared, and for the last several years has been pushed out as an annual safety report. So we have some information, albeit internal reporting going on, but very, very transparent sets of information that are out there. Now, comparing that to the Scaffolding Association. So the Scaffolding Association was found in 2011. Although still a relatively young organization, they now boast the largest number of members. So they're now, from a member company perspective, the largest trade association for scaffolding in the UK. They have an audit and an assessed membership scheme in addition to a basic sort of all-comers type membership. So the audited and assessed members are audited by a independent third-party auditing house. So it's not a peer audit. It's done externally to check their standard around the same life cycle from an audit perspective as NASC. But certainly built around the construction requirements and the industry as a whole. Now, members are reporting safety incidents annually directly to the association in somewhat a similar way to NASC, but Scaffolding Association at this time isn't publishing these publicly. They're actually being rolled up through the SEC group, which is a Specialist Engineering Contractors Association in the UK, of which they're a member of and have been for a while. So those numbers do get rolled up and collated, and we hope to have some more information on that as the year goes forward to sort of solidify our response. But looking at the two side by side, we can pull some interesting details out of this, especially considering the size of the industry as a whole. So you can see here that the approximate number of trades that the NASC support, or the workers within the scaffolding trade that the NASC have, is around 17,000 on-site workers. Scaffolding Association accounts for about 10,000, giving us a total of about 27,000 people that are working for companies that are member companies of a trade association, which is certainly interesting. When we consider that to the size of the market as a whole, so the UK scaffolding market is somewhere in the order of 3.1 billion per year. This information is pulled from the ONS, the Office of National Statistics in the UK, which is a tremendous resource for us to try and pull this data, because it also gives us data on the fatality information and also some of the reporting that's going on. So when we look at that, we can see that there's around 5,738 companies actually listed as scaffold companies in the UK. Now, the vast majority of those, you can see based upon the 626 member companies of organizations, are actually small companies. There's an awful lot of subcontracting goes on in the UK. where small scaffold gangs or teams will subcontract their services to larger companies, and that makes up the significant portion of those 5,000 or so extra companies. What was interesting, as I mentioned here, looking at this, is the fact that there's 80% of the workers are actually employed by a member of the trade group. Now, some of the reporting that's going on is interesting. I've dropped a reference in here to the NASC report from 2020, although we didn't use those numbers directly for this, because the report just came out yesterday, in fact. But you'll see that they take the approach and report on a significant number of data points, including things like the size of scaffold, if there was a fall, what height was the fall from, and the resulting impact of it. Now, some of this reporting does line up with the requirements of HSE. So they're really reporting and extending that reporting from HSE, but it allows us to take a little snippet of information and pull that out. Sam's just sharing a touch of information here with you just to sort of give you an idea. You can see there's a heck of a lot of data tables in there. No doubt this is definitely a piece that's put to show their value as a trade association or confederation, but the data that they place here is that self-reported data. So they showing that within their organization for 5 years now, they've not had a fatality, and a significant number. In fact, you can see there was just 74 incidents that were reported in 2019. So good data, and I'm sure that when the presentation goes out, you'll be able to take a look at that if there's interest, and take a look through there. Now, moving past that, we wanted to try and begin to look at what the differences beyond organizations and what the differences are in particular markets. So we're able to pull some information together, again, from our statistical reporting that can see some key factors. For example, the orange line that you're seeing on the screen there is the number of inspectors per 100,000 workers in a country, and then the blue is the fatalities per 100,000. Of interesting note, the US is operating with 0.7 inspectors per 100,000 against that 5.2 fatalities per 100,000. When we look at the UK, there's a slight change, and it's where the flip happens to some degree, and that's where we see 3 inspectors per 100,000 against that 0.8 fatalities per 100,000. Now, you'd like to think initially that means that more inspectors creates a safer environment, until we look at some of the outlying data. And you look at Germany, for example, with 14 inspectors per 100,000, and then significantly higher in terms of 0.2 higher fatalities per 100,000. So, you know, we don't have straight, clear answers that more inspectors on the ground means a safer work environment directly, or there maybe is a critical mass, but it's something that we feel is worth continuing that investigation to see if we can draw some lessons learned to try and help make the industry safer from an overall perspective. So moving forward, as a council here, we want to continue this research to try and understand these best practices and see if we can find a sweet spot in terms of what other similar developing and developed countries are doing, to see if there's lessons that can be learned to bring back to our industry, to continue that look. We've started to reach out to other trade associations, IPAF being one, and also looking beyond that into other countries and trying to gain some information perhaps from perhaps Germany, from Scandinavia, and try and pull some data together to try and understand what that looks like. Also looking at potentially pulling data from Australia and New Zealand moving forward, just to try and round out our research to truly understand what we can gain from that. And that's something that I think we'd like to try and move forward with and try and pull that forward. And we're also thinking about the conference, and Sam will give an update on that side of it for what we hope to try and do later this year.
There was one additional slide which for some reason was left out, but pretty much, as to pick up on what Andrew said, is, the question is why are You know, why are other countries, you know, having a better safety rating than the U.S.? And, you know, at this point right now, I can say that we've done a lot of research, but not enough to make a conclusive a statement. I mean, there are a lot of indication that the UK and Europe has much more strict regulations. For example, I know that you know, you got to do, and anybody working in Europe, Andrew, you can concur that, you know, you have to do a risk assessment. It's a requirement that you do a risk assessment, even for a small residential building, not just a large construction site. There's also a requirement for training, that you have to be trained, not on the job training, but as an employee. In some countries in Europe, you have to have the training before you become employed. And then, as you know, then there's the question of the number of inspectors and how severe are fines. For example, Andrew, I remember you in your research, you found, I think, the average inspection, the average fine was 65,000 pounds.
That's right. Yeah. So in the UK, there was, from a prosecution standpoint for major cases, back between 2018 and 19, there was 40 defendants prosecuted for 48 offences with 44 convictions, a 92% conviction rate, and that totaled fines-wise of 2.8 million pounds, giving us a 64,192 average per fine. That was levied against those, and that's just against the working at height regulations. So that's where the vast majority of that scaffold work will come into.
Yeah, so we see a lot of differences, and we found a lot of differences in our research. Which factor is the biggest contributor to improving the better ratings? We're not sure, and as Andrew said, we want to continue to do this research and pull what we can out of it that possibly, you know, help us better understand it. And just for the, you know, regarding the impact and significance on it, you know, the US on average, the data shows that we have a fatality rating in the construction industry of 16 deaths per 100,000. The best rating is the UK at 2 deaths per 100,000. So if we improve our rating to meet UK standard, for example, then you lower it by 14 deaths per 100,000, which equates to about 800 lives saved a year in the construction industry alone. So I think it's got a potential to have a lot of, to have a big impact, and it's important. Regarding our conference 2020, you know, we're going to be looking for a speaker possibly in the Phoenix area. I'm assuming we're going to be meeting up, but I know a lot is in the air, but up in the air, but we're going to be looking for somebody either in the Phoenix area or possibly the LA area. We're considering getting speakers to talk about maybe immigration and visas. There was a recent announcement a week ago by the administration that because of unemployment being high, they were considering ending work visa programs. That's a topic I believe we believe is going to be impactful on the construction industry in the US possibly. So anybody's got any suggestions or a speaker in mind at this point right now, we're open to suggestions, and we're open to any suggestions that you guys have. With that, I guess we'll open the floor up for any questions.
Sam, Tom Brewer here. Any comments on the supply of scaffolding coming into the United States and its COVID-19 impact and what we should expect as far as availability of equipment going forward?
Well, I mean, I didn't look at those numbers before the presentation. I would say supply is not going to be an issue. I say demand is going to be an issue. That would be my projection. You know, I mean, with the economy, you know, unemployment high and GDP low, oil markets in the toilet, and that's a huge part of our industry's, you know, growth area. I don't think there's going to be an issue with supply. I think the demand's going to be an issue. Anybody have an opinion on it? Yeah.
From the number of emails I'm getting every day about people wanting to sell me imported scaffolding, I would say supply is probably not a problem.
There you go. There you go.
That's a good point. Just didn't know if they're still on the boats coming in.
I saw an article, I saw an article in the New York Times about China. It said, they're kind of ahead of it in front of us as far as the timeline. They said the title of the heading was Chinese factories are open for business, but their consumers are very skittish, and the consumer confidence in China is going down. So they're internally not, the demand internally in China, for example, is very low.
Hey Sam, just a comment on your speakers. As you're doing some additional work on the presentation you've just given us, we have hopefully a wider audience in Phoenix. I thought there was an excellent presentation, and maybe something that you actually could just expand upon for Phoenix.
Yeah, that's something that we were considering doing. I know we had this discussion, Jackie and Andrew, on it. I mean, I'm open to any ideas. I mean, there could be a speaker that we find that maybe can add a perspective to this that maybe can help us, as well. I think this topic has got a lot of room for research. I think it's got a lot of room for additional research, and I think the findings can be promising, but I don't know. I mean, I'm open to different ideas. I mean, I'm open to do for us to do a presentation on it if we don't find a speaker necessarily that kind of will be that provide that would be a good fit, but I'm not sure at this point.
You could also do two. You could also do two presentations as well. They'll split the time up.
Okay. Thanks for the suggestion. We'll consider it, yeah.
Sam,
And I know, Steve, I appreciate the help. I know you and I have been discussing the last week. I know you've got a lot of experience with the NASC and the IPAF as well. I mean, that's an area we're going to be looking at a lot more. We didn't expound on it too much in this presentation because of a time constraint, but that's definitely something we're going to look into a lot more in the future.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I have a question regarding data collection. I don't know whether we do or not, but the two organizations in the UK, their data collection on that information is extremely powerful. Is this something that the SAI can do or already does? If so, I'm not aware of it.
Well, I mean, I don't think that we're currently doing that, and I don't think that the OSHA at this point segments. If anybody knows differently, let me know. But I don't think we have too much information that's specific about our industry's impact on fatalities within the overall construction industry. I saw a report in my research from 1970 or 1973 that OSHA did a very detailed study where they extrapolated from the construction fatalities, how many of them were related or at all related to scaffold, and what kind of equipment. In other words, the fatality occurred on what product line, and so it was a lot of that, but it was a pretty intensive study that they're not doing on a yearly basis. If anybody else knows of that, but at this point right now, I think that is a bit of a blind spot for our data.
Yeah, I think the OSHA seems to concentrate more on citations. That's what gets reported here far more than the deaths, I think.
In looking through a lot of that, Steve, too, we were able to pull a lot of data based around the citations, and in some cases, there's descriptions from the investigation, but it's limited to keyword type searches. So you're never sure. You can do a search, with one set of keywords and pull up a different set of data just by modifying the keyword slightly. There's a lot of cross correlation needed to try and understand those figures and get it down there. It's not even broken out necessarily by SIC codes or anything along those lines like we find in other jurisdictions. It's unfortunate because there is some good data collected, but again, around the citations and certainly around major incidents and fatalities. But it's tough to pull that data together when it's not tabular. It's really hard to get into it, and a lot of reading. We tried to do some of that to back up some of our findings, in fact, and found that we kept running into that situation.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we set as certainly a goal when we first started doing long-term projections for the association back in 2008, was to get scaffolding certainly off number one on the list of citations, and I mean ultimately was to get it out of the top 10. But when we started digging into the data, we found again, it was definitely difficult to find information that really helped us do a better job. Yes, from the published data, it's not easy.
You know, I had this thought. I mean, this is obviously beyond the scope of the International Council, but the idea that I thought was that when OSHA starts documenting incidences and fatalities, they have got a survey sheet that they fill out. I'd be interested to know if I mean, it would be interesting to know if they were able to add to that questionnaire and survey certain information that would help our industry segment, okay, in construction, was it related to a scaffold, a specific design, because, they collect that information and just add to that, then that would give us more information. And that could go a long way in reducing the number of citations. If we find that scaffolding related construction, related to the structure or some of these citations is not actually a source of a lot of